The cougar entered the pine stand the way it always did, low, controlled, deliberate. Its body flowed between trunks in near silence, shoulders rising and falling smoothly beneath tawny fur. Needles carpeted the ground thickly here, layered deep with years of fallen cones, bark, and softened earth. Normally, this forest spoke quietly but reliably. Each step produced a faint response, a whisper of compression, a subtle shift of debris, a sound that returned information. Tonight, nothing answered. The cougar placed one forepaw down and paused mid-transfer of weight. No crunch, no rustle, no muted give. The ground accepted the pressure without a sound, as if it were absorbing not just impact, but existence. The cougar froze. Stillness was not unusual. Silence was. The cat lifted its paw again and set it down more firmly, testing. The forest floor remained mute. Needles did not slide. Cones did not click together. Even the faint exhale of displaced air failed to stir debris. This was wrong. The cougar straightened slightly and lifted its head, ears rotating independently. Sound in pine forests carried strangely, softened, redirected, but never erased completely. Tonight, the air felt padded, dense, unwilling to transmit even the smallest disturbance. The cougar took another step. Nothing. Its tail lowered closer to the ground, tip held rigid to avoid brushing against needles or branches. Whiskers stretched forward, reading air movement where sound refused to exist. Cold hung low between trunks, thickened by moisture that had not yet settled into frost. The forest smelled alive. That made the silence worse. There was deer here, faint, recent. The cougar could smell their passage in crushed needles and the lingering warmth of breath trapped low to the ground. Prey had moved through not long ago. Normally, that meant noise, a snapped twig, a shifting cone, something. But the ground gave no sound. The cougar slowed further, entering a pace so controlled it bordered on immobility. Every step was placed vertically, lifted and lowered without drag. Even so, the absence of response unsettled the cat. Sound was feedback. Sound confirmed contact, balance, timing. Without it, movement became guesswork. The cougar stopped beside a fallen pine, trunk darkened with age and damp. It tested the log with a careful touch of its paw. The bark was soft, decomposing, a surface that should have whispered at least slightly. Silence. The cougar's ears flattened briefly, then rose again. Not fear, recalibration. A forest that did not answer footfall removed one of the cat's oldest tools, the ability to measure its own presence. The cougar crouched and pressed its chest lightly into the ground, testing contact through its body rather than its feet. Even then, nothing shifted. The forest floor behaved less like earth and more like felt, dense, muffling, swallowing all indication of motion. The cat lifted its head and scanned ahead. Moonlight filtered weakly through pine needles, casting narrow bands of pale light that failed to reach the ground fully. Shadows lay thick and undisturbed. Somewhere deeper in the forest, something moved, or had moved, but the cougar could not tell when or where. This silence was not helpful. Predators relied on quiet, but they also relied on response. Soundlessness erased not only the cougar's own noise, but the noise of others. Prey could move without announcing itself. Competitors could approach without warning. The cougar remained still for a long moment. In most hunts, silence was an ally. Here, it was an unknown. The cat rose slowly and took another step forward, committing to motion despite the lack of feedback. Muscles remained ready, weight balanced to allow instant correction if the ground betrayed it. Still nothing. The forest held its breath. The cougar understood then that this night would not be navigated by memory alone. The pine stand had changed its behavior, moisture, temperature, and compression combining to erase sound entirely. Movement here would have to be governed by sight and scent alone, both less reliable under trees this dense. The cougar did not retreat. But it did not hurry. As it moved deeper between the pines, body ghosting forward through a world that refused to acknowledge its presence, the cat faced a rare condition, a hunting ground so quiet that even the hunter could not hear itself. And in that quiet, the cougar began to understand that the danger tonight was not being heard, but being unable to hear the forest when it finally decided to move back. The cougar moved again, but slower than before. Without sound, each step felt longer than it was. Distance lost proportion. The cat could no longer rely on the subtle rhythm of footfall to measure how far it had travelled or how quickly it was moving. The forest became a place without tempo. That was dangerous. The cougar paused and turned its head slightly, aligning one ear forward, the other back, searching for contrast. Usually, silence had texture, a baseline hum broken by small interruptions. Here, the baseline itself was gone. The absence was uniform, flattening space the way fog flattened sight. The cougar tested a new angle. It stepped onto a patch where needles thinned and bare soil showed through. The paw pressed down with deliberate pressure, claws partially extended. Earth should have shifted. It should have whispered or sighed. It did nothing. The cat lifted the paw and examined the ground visually. The soil was dark, damp, compressed. Moisture filled the spaces between particles, binding them together, turning the forest floor into a soundless mat. Recent melt, perhaps, followed by cold that sealed everything in place. The cougar adjusted. It began placing its paws more vertically, minimizing lateral movement entirely. No sliding, no rolling of debris. This was not stealth. It was compensation. The cat was now hunting in a space where it could not hear itself, and therefore could not judge how audible it might be to others. The forest smelled closer now. Deer scent layered faintly ahead, fresher than before. The cougar lifted its head and breathed slowly, drawing information from the air rather than the ground. This worked, partially. Scent confirmed presence, but not direction or speed. The cougar crouched and waited. If the prey moved, the cat would see it before hearing it. That inversion of senses felt wrong, but it was workable. The cougar's vision adapted quickly, focusing on movement rather than outline. Minutes passed. Nothing moved. The cougar shifted its weight slightly, and even that produced no sound. The realization deepened. The forest would not warn the cougar if something else moved either. Another predator could approach just as silently. A falling branch might not announce itself until impact. The cougar's muscles tightened subtly. Silence like this erased margins of error. The cat moved toward a cluster of young pines where spacing widened and moonlight reached the ground more clearly. Here, sight would at least offer scale. The transition was slow, careful, every step placed with intention. As the cougar entered the lighter patch, it stopped. A shape stood ahead, barely visible, pale against darker trunks. A deer, head down, feeding quietly, unaware. Normally, such a moment would be accompanied by sound, a nibble, a shift, a breath. There was none. The cougar watched, unmoving. Distance was hard to judge without sound. The deer looked closer than it might be. The forest silence made it impossible to tell whether the deer had just arrived or had been there for minutes. The cougar did not stalk yet. It waited, letting sight do what hearing could not. The deer lifted its head briefly, ears rotating, then lowered it again. No alarm. No reaction. The cougar's body lowered fractionally, weight settling into its hind legs. The moment was forming, but slowly, carefully, under rules that felt altered. The forest remained mute. And as the cougar held position, watching prey in a world where sound had been stripped away, it understood that the hunt would depend not on how quietly it could move, but on whether it could trust silence that offered no warning in return. The cougar stayed low, eyes fixed on the deer ahead. In a forest that spoke, this would have been the moment to read small sounds. The scrape of teeth on bark, the shift of hooves, the cadence of breathing. Those cues usually told the hunter when the prey was about to move. when attention wavered, when the instant of vulnerability approached. Here, there was nothing to read. The deer lifted its head again. Still no sound. The cougar felt the tension rise along its spine, not the clean focus that preceded a leap, but a more careful strain, the effort of holding readiness without confirmation. Without sound, the cat could not tell whether the deer had sensed something or whether it was simply pausing between bites. The cougar edged forward one slow step. The ground accepted it completely. No needle shifted, no cone rolled, no whisper betrayed the movement. The cat paused, surprised by its own invisibility. This silence did not just hide the cougar, it erased it. That was dangerous in a different way. Predators relied on feedback to regulate speed and force. When nothing answered, it became easy to move too far, too fast, to cross invisible thresholds without realizing it. A sudden charge now could overshoot, collide, or reveal itself at the wrong moment. The cougar advanced another step, then stopped. The deer shifted position, angling slightly, exposing its flank. The distance closed, or appeared to. Without sound, the space between them felt unstable, elastic. The cougar's eyes narrowed, recalibrating depth through parallax and shadow alone. This was enough. The cougar lowered its body further, muscles tightening, weight shifting backward. Vision took over fully now. The cat focused on line, on angle, on the exact placement of the deer's legs. It prepared to launch. Then something moved behind the cougar. Not sound, pressure. The cougar felt it as a subtle displacement of air along its flank, a change too faint to be a breeze. Instinct snapped the cat's attention away from the deer instantly. Its body froze, muscles locked mid-preparation. Nothing followed. The deer remained ahead, still feeding. But the cougar did not move again. That sensation was enough. In a forest that gave no sound, anything approaching would arrive without warning. Another predator. A falling limb. Even the deer itself could bolt unpredictably, turning the space between them into chaos. The cougar eased its weight back, abandoning the launch without visible reaction. Hunger protested, sharp and immediate, but caution overruled it. A silent forest removed the buffer that usually separated opportunity from disaster. The cougar waited longer, watching the deer drift slowly away, step by silent step. The chance dissolved without noise, without chase, without conclusion. This was not failure, it was restraint under altered rules. The cougar remained where it was, breathing slow, senses stretched thin across a forest that refused to signal intent or consequence. Tonight, silence did not mean safety, it meant uncertainty. And as the cougar finally shifted direction, choosing deeper cover and firmer ground where sound might return in fragments, it carried forward a hard-earned understanding that a place which gave no sound could not be trusted, not for stalking, not for warning, and not for the moment when movement mattered most. In this forest, the cougar would have to listen not for noise, but for the rare, dangerous instant when silence itself broke. The cougar withdrew without haste. It did not turn its back on the deer all at once, nor did it rush into cover. Instead, it eased sideways, step by step, choosing ground it had already tested, ground whose silence it understood. Each movement was deliberate, reversible. Nothing in the forest reacted. That confirmed the decision. The cat shifted into denser cover where pine trunks stood closer together and the slope angled gently upward. Here, even without sound, the terrain offered structure, tighter spacing, clearer edges, fewer unknowns. The cougar paused and lifted its head, scanning back toward the open patch where the deer still fed. The deer was farther now, not because it had fled, but because time had moved on without resolution. The moment had passed quietly, the way everything passed in this forest tonight. The cougar settled briefly on a low rise, chest against earth, tail curved loosely behind, muscles loosened just enough to release the tension of a hunt that had never fully begun. Hunger remained, but it no longer pressed urgently. The cat had not wasted energy. That mattered. Here, at least, the ground offered faint feedback. A paw pressed into thinner needles produced the slightest compression, not sound, but resistance. The cougar could measure itself again. Balance returned, scale reassembled. The forest ahead was darker, colder, less forgiving in other ways, but it would speak eventually. A snapped twig, a sliding cone, a sound small enough to matter. The cougar rose and moved on. Behind it, the silent patch remained unchanged, a pocket of ground where moisture and cold had erased all response, where movement carried no warning and no confirmation. It was a place that looked perfect for a hunter and functioned like a trap. The cougar would remember it. Not as fear, but as knowledge. As the cat disappeared between the pines, body dissolving into shadow that finally behaved as expected, the forest began, slowly, to return to itself. A branch shifted somewhere higher up. Needles settled. Sound, faint but present, crept back into the world. The cougar paused once more and listened. Yes, this was better. Tonight's hunt would continue elsewhere, under rules that made sense again, where silence hid movement but did not erase consequence. The ground that gave no sound was left behind, intact and unchanged, holding its quiet for whatever stepped into it next. And because the cougar had recognized when silence stopped being an ally, it carried its strength forward, uninjured, unseen, and prepared to hunt again when the forest chose to answer back.